For our first part of the final project, we're going to be doing a type portrait. And as it says here, we're going to create a caricature self-portrait using only type. Challenges and goals. I'll try not to read these things like word for word, but we're only going to use the letters in your name to create your self-portrait. You can only use a letter once unless it's repeated in your name. So like I can use 2 T's because I have H-U-R-T-T. You can use your full name if you choose, like we talked about at the beginning of the semester. Like nobody but my mom calls me Andrew, but if you want to have more letters, you can use Andrew instead of Andy, things like that. So if you want some more letters, you can use your full name. I've even seen, what's that? Yep, I was just about to say, some people that have just generally, I had one student, I can't remember off the top of my head, but they had like a very short name, and it wasn't short, like it was like, if I'm looking at you, for lack of a better word, for lack of a better name, I'm thinking like his name was Pat, but it wasn't short for, it was just Pat, it wasn't short for Patrick or anything or whatever, so he was like, ugh. So I used his middle name too. So yes, you can use your middle name if you have, shortened name, or if you wanted to do, like if I just wanted to use Andy and my middle name, like whatever, it's up to you. But you can only use one letter, or use the letter once unless it's repeated in your name. Those that have longer names might find it a little bit, not tricky, but when you have a long name, you are required to use all of the letters. Let's see, work in an 8.5 by 11 portrait orientation to make sure that your caricature is as big as possible, like fill the space. I have had people in the past go landscape because they wanted to include, like, you'll see when we get to the examples, but they wanted to include more shoulders or something like that or whatever. But if there's a reason to go landscape, just let me know when you're allowed. But you generally work in an 8.5 by 11 space, so we can fill the space. And what we're doing with this is to utilize Illustrator tools, adjusting points and shapes, design balance, using type as a design element. And think about things to consider using the letter forms non-traditionally to best represent formal elements. So we've been talking about things like balance, positive, negative space, things like that, to create a balanced design. And I will show you some samples. And I want you to include the name as well, so I know what font you chose. So when we choose our fonts as well, you don't have to. You can use whatever font you choose to use. In this case, Ryan chose Papyrus, sort of as a joke. This was kind of an ongoing joke that semester with Papyrus and Comic Sans and all that fun stuff. So he wanted to use Papyrus just to kind of be funny. But also because it offered, you can see with it being distressed and kind of jagged, it also offered more. It also offered more adjustment points, things like that when you're using your direct selection tool. But you can see some of these. You can see some of the letter forms a little bit more clearly, and then some of them are, stretched out, and a lot of them are unrecognizable, which is fine. But yeah, you'll see a good balance of having the letter forms relatively stay the same, but also be pretty unrecognizable as well. You can add color if you want. Some students chose to use color to represent the different parts of the body here. And you can see in this one, relatively, very little has changed with the letters. The letters are very, very recognizable, but still give you a good, a good sort of caricature. And that's what you're thinking about these things too. Like you can sort of try to go as realistic as possible if you want, or you can go as caricature as you want as well, as long as it essentially looks like you. And if you think about when you think about things like caricatures, like usually what they do is, obviously they'll focus on, an element, like for me, the last time, my old job, we had a party and they had an artist and whatever. And of course, the first thing that they focus on is like the giant beard. So it's like this huge beard and all hair and like whatever. And then, so you focus on a piece so you have like a recognizable element, right? And then go from there. Like in this case, this one was a bit more, I'd say a bit more on the realistic-ish side, less caricature anyway, and a nice use of color, a subtle use of the couple different browns in the hair, and then again you can see that there's barely any recognizable letters. There's a couple in here that they just kind of flipped and rotated and manipulated a little bit to give a little bit of texture to the hair. And then you have the E's here for the eyes, and then the rest of it is pretty wide open. Again, this one, I think there's two of these. There's a color one and a black and white one. This one, again, sort of going back to the Jeffries. This one, again, that you can see that they've used mostly shearing and rotating. Haven't really manipulated or broken apart, I guess, the letters as much as some of the others. The letters are still largely recognizable. And a lot you can see here, like they've taken that N or the H, I wish they included their name, but the N or the H there, and sheared it to the right and gave it a little bit of, use some of the warp effects and things like that to give it a little bit of texture. There we go. That would be an H, or it could be an N too. But then adding color, adding some gradient fills to it to give it a little bit more depth, things like that. Again, you don't have to work in color, but if you choose to, you certainly can. If you want to add a little bit more to it. Again, here, a lot of the letters are largely unrecognizable, but then there's like a little pop for an earring there with the R. It's a nice little touch to have like the R largely untouched for an earring there. You can probably pick out a couple other letters if you look into it. And then this one, very, very simple, but very effective. You can see obviously pulling apart the letters pretty effectively. I think there was 3 letters in here, and then the rest were used. She kind of like buried them within this hairline here, and then I like the little cowlick or whatever you would call it there. And then, lastly, I don't know why that showed up so small. That might pixelate a little bit. But again, you can see a little bit more abstract usage of letters, but gives you the overall shape, the overall look. And again, obviously, it helps if you know these people. And I have a couple that I could show you of people that we know. Just to show you. Maybe. So for those that know Aileen, this was her project. And then she actually chose to like list, this is certainly not required, but she went above and beyond and listed like exactly what she did to each letter and what she used each letter for. But again, a really good balance of pulling apart the letters. So some of them are unrecognizable, like in the hairline, but then some of them are very recognizable. Some of these in the hair, they flipped, rotated. She included the font just in case you didn't have it on your machine. A nice touch with the earring, the swirl there. And then she actually did separated hers into layers as well. Sometimes, like the one that was Jeffrey Frank Taylor there, he had his separated into layers. You certainly don't have to. Sometimes for something like this, she chose to do it because she knew it was gonna be like relatively complicated, and she wanted to keep each element separated. A lot of times when I'm working with like a really sort of intense, complicated illustration, I'll also separate it like that, just so you know, and that way, like when you're done with the face, you can lock it, and then that way you don't accidentally like mess around with it or select. If you like how this is, and you don't want to accidentally move it or manipulate it, you put it in a different layer, lock it down, so you don't accidentally, even like the hair is on a separate layer, and the face, and then she had the outline, and then her info on a separate page, so you don't accidentally mess around with it. And then I'll show you one more. Oops. Don't save. From someone that we know. This one came out great. For those of you that know Isaac, this one came out great. Again, he kind of exploded a few of the letters. I think there was pucker and bloat going on, and a couple other effects that were in there that we've worked with. To create the hair, he chose to focus really on the hair and the glasses, like that was his thing. And then you can, again, see a good balance between really breaking apart the letters and having, this bee, and then he pulled apart the tail, the serif of the bee to give the glasses like an arm. And then that sort of started giving him a little bit of perspective, so he started building it that way, kind of like from the right side forward. So there's a lot of simple, effective things. A lot of simple, effective things going on here, and I'll show you one more that came out really great. Stella, for those of you that know Stella, hers came out excellent. She chose to go a little bit more caricature. She wanted to specifically go in like sort of a comic strip style, and then went with a more stylized font. And you can see for the hair, I have no idea what letter that is. Maybe an N, maybe an H, but really pulled it apart nicely. And then you can see again a good balance of like the J for the eyebrow here, and then the S easily for the mouth, and then the little choker necklace there is a nice little touch. But again, you can see a really nice balance, a nice balanced design first of all, but then a nice balance between heavy and thin strokes to create some, I know this is largely flat, but to create a little bit of depth, but to give a nice balance between thick and thin, a good design balance in general, and a nice balance between having some of the letters recognizable and pulling apart some of the letters so they're not recognizable. And again, we can go through, I'm just going to make a new file really quick. When we're working with these, let's create, I'm just going to go 8.5 by 11. So when we're working with these, I'm just going to do my first name here. And you can choose to go all caps if you want, upper and lowercase. All of these choices are going to be completely up to you. I'm just going to grab a random font here. Let's grab some, all right, maybe not so random. All right, let's go with this. So let's say you choose the font that you want. Let's say we go with this one because we like how many points it might offer for adjustment, things like that. So what you're going to do is you're going to have your name somewhere in the document. What I would suggest is making a copy. So you might have, the font that you actually used up at the top. And if you use something that's a little strange, like in this case, if you use something that's a little wacky, I would outline it and keep it up at the top, just so that when I open the file, it doesn't not show. I don't know. I would assume that probably not too many people have this system font in this room. I think I installed this one on this machine. So what I generally do is make a copy, and I just held my option and dragged, or copy and paste. And then we're going to create outlines. We'll do it on both of them. Under type, create outlines. And then this way we have, they're no longer a font, and it's an editable thing that we can mess around with. And then we're going to ungroup, because it'll automatically group the letters once we outline them, and now you have the individual letters to play around with. And again, I'm not going to go through this like whole thing, but you can play around with size. think about like the simple rotations, or even as simple as when we grab some of the letters, oops, if you wanted to, kind of like Isaac did with his glasses there. Let's say we want to select these points, and I keep messing it up. Now I'm just selecting my anchor points. And then, oops, I missed one, but you get the idea. There it is. And I missed another one. Anyway, you get the general idea of, there we go, let's say we wanted to, stretch these out. You can adjust your curves and lines like we did before. So you can physically manipulate this, well, not physically, but digitally manipulate these till they're, fairly unrecognizable if you choose to. Where some people were getting those like odd textures like that is when you have these pads. I know we have some experience with it when we're using working with the pen tool and the Bezier curve to trace objects and things like that. When you get paths that overlap, and once you start to like drag like these 3 points, if we're dragging them up and they're not overlapping with anything, obviously the thickness is just moved towards the top. But once we start to sort of overlap other points, you can see, if I can zoom in at the same time, which I can't, you can see you get these kind of funky overlaps. And what that is basically it's the vectors go from the shortest point to the shortest path from point to point, from anchor to anchor. So a lot of times if you have an overlap like this, it creates this negative space. So a lot of texture can be created just by simply sort of overlapping. And when I say sort of break apart and explode some of these letters, by breaking apart, simply just by dragging some of our letters together. So a lot of the texture from like hair, things like that, were created this way. Again, just by sort of dragging. And if you wanted this to be, let's rotate it this way. For whatever reason, we wanted this to be like the bottom of my beard, and then we could have, leave a D alone for the most part to create an I. Things like that. What I would suggest as well is finding a picture of yourself that you want to use. You can even just take a selfie. Or if you have a particular picture that you want to use, place that image to use it as a guide as well. You can place it and lock it, and then you can kind of use that to sort of trace basic shapes if you wanted to focus on, like if I wanted to focus on my giant black glasses and, beard, you could kind of give yourself something to use as, rather than try to go freehand. Some people did go sort of freehand with it and had success with it if you feel comfortable doing that, and a lot of people placed an image and just used that as sort of a guide to get a general idea. Again, you sort of focus on like drawing almost anything, but you focus on larger elements first, and then you sort of get to the details. So you rough out your general larger shapes, if you had, like with me, like hair, beard, glasses, eyes generally, where you want them, and then you can build the details out afterwards. Again, we can do things, you can use any of these effects that we've played around with a bit. If you wanted to create a little bit of texture, things like that, don't be afraid to play around with some of these effects. Pretty much anything, again, anything that we've covered for the semester. If you wanted to, again, this is sort of beating it to death here, but if you wanted to create sort of a funky, if you wanted it to sort of be, if your hair was a little bit like this, give or take. I'm just kind of making shapes and then finding things to use them for. But, you know, you get the general idea. You know, play around with it. You know, it sounds cheesy, but have some fun with it. You can also, I had one student delete some anchor points, which you can do. I wouldn't do it too much, but you can use your delete anchor point tools, your convert anchor point tools if you wanted to convert a smooth anchor point to a corner anchor point, things like that. You know, again, think about some of the simpler things that we've worked with. We've worked with over the semester. The only thing I would ask is to not add anchor points, or not add too many. Like, don't create a whole new shape, you know, with the letter. You know, if you have this D, adding like 100 anchor points here, just to give yourself more anchor points. If you want to add like 1 or 2 maybe, then I'll go with it. But again, you know, use everything that we've learned over the semester to create these type portraits.